So I already introduced Mohamed, and we already got to know Christie, but I think the two people on the panel that we don't know are Kelly and JoAnne, and I will briefly introduce them. So JoAnne is a cardiologist and was a professor at Harvard for many years, and then went into industry and has had a really amazing career at multiple different companies, including Merck and Janssen, and now she is the Chief Medical Officer of Esperion. And what is really amazing about JoAnne is she has an incredible group of people that she has mentored. And so a lot of people here know Fatima Rodriguez, who is one of her mentees, and she tells me all these stories about JoAnne when she would go to JoAnne's office and ask JoAnne advice, and how JoAnne was just so supportive of women pursuing their passions. And at Esperion, one of the things that she's done is whenever we've asked her for support for any kind of women's initiative, she always figures out how to make it happen. So she's one of those people that doesn't just talk about supporting women's initiatives, she actually does it. And we're just so grateful to have her as one of our supporters. Esperion is supporting our dinner tonight. But she's just a fabulous mentor to all of us. And so, again, she's also very quiet. So anybody that doesn't know her, you need to introduce yourself to her. And then Kelly Lewis. She is a force of nature. She is at Novartis, and she is the executive medical director and head of atherosclerosis. But Kelly, what I mean by Kelly is a force of nature, she's also someone who doesn't just talk. She gets stuff done. So when I first met her, I was talking to her about how do we get more women in clinical trials? And guess what she did? She helped make it happen. She got me, a couple of other people on clinical trial executive committees. Whenever there's an opportunity, do you know what Kelly says? She asks me, Roxana, and other people, who are the women that I can put on? Give me a list of the women. And she does it. She makes it happen. Again, very quiet, but just someone who has moved the needle. So, one of the things we're talking about at this conference is not just saying we need to do this, not just saying that there's a problem, but doing something about the problem. And here you have people on this panel who are doing a lot. And we all know Roxana, through her Women as One, is also really moving the needle in terms of providing the training and the mentorship that women need to lead these trials. So I want to make this as interactive with the audience as possible. So we'll have some questions, but in between the questions, we'll take your feedback and your questions. So I'm going to just start, and I've kind of randomly picked a couple of people just to give us some basics. So Mohamed, tell us the basics of clinical trials. What's phase 1? What's phase 2? What's phase 3?
Sure. First, thank you for this opportunity. Really an important topic, and really wonderful to share the stage with some of these esteemed and really leaders in this field. So really appreciate the opportunity. Now, if you're here for the next 7 hours, I can maybe start talking. But really very, very briefly, clinical trials. I think if you talk about clinical trials, in some way, we have to think in the context of clinical research. So clinical trials, maybe we talk about the randomized controlled trials, for example, but there are different kinds of clinical research. For example, you could do clinical trials, but you could do other things in clinical research that includes observational studies, real-world evidence studies, non-interventional studies, and so on. So that's one thing. And, in the context of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, we have to also think of another important element, which is the difference between clinical research and clinical care. Just to give you a bit of a grounding there. So, clinical care is where we practice based on guideline recommended therapy and, of course, approved, standards of care and so on. But when it comes to clinical research is when you are actually conducting an experiment. Randomized controlled trials, for example, you can only do it ethically if you genuinely don't know the answer. So that's, another important, the answer to the question. For example, applying a therapeutic option in the context of a given disease. We cannot treat people, for example, now with a statin versus placebo without anything else in the background, because we know it's now approved, actually has been shown to be effective as a standard of care. So that's, another important element. Now, as far as clinical trials go in the context of RCTs, for example, there are different phases of this clinical research, spectrum. We have the so-called phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There's also such a thing as phase 3B, phase 4, and so on. And this is really a spectrum of how a pharmaceutical manufacturer, for example, or other entities can test a given therapeutic modality or a new biological entity, for example, to try to bring it to be available in the clinic through a standardized process that includes running randomized controlled trials, but also interacting with regulatory agencies and so on. So, for example, phase 1 studies, this is where, the beginning of that marks the so-called first human dose. So this is when you begin testing a given therapeutic modality. It could be a new one. It could be, belonging to an existing class of drugs that you first administer in humans to test whether or not this particular agent has some effect. In that phase 1 studies, they are generally small-scale studies that include 50 to 100 volunteers that are actually otherwise healthy. So they don't really test those with the disease in phase 1, more likely than not. And it really looks for that early, kind of, safety and dynamics, kinetics, and so on. Now, if you're successful with phase 1, then you go on to phase 2, and in phase 2, then you begin kind of enrolling patients that are with the target disease, if you will. And again, these are still relatively small studies, perhaps maybe 100 to 1,000 patients in each of the studies, and it will look at early signs of efficacy. It also looks at dose finding. It looks at maybe titration schedules and so on and so on. So that's phase 2. Successful in phase 2, then you begin talking about phase 3. So the phase 3 program, then this is where the confirmation, if you will, of the findings in phase 2 is where you take through into phase 3. And in phase 3, you run studies that could be anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000 patients in a given study. In fact, more recently, you could see trends of 17,000 patients, for example, in studies such as the Select trial with semaglutide. Now, so phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In phase 3 is where you begin really narrowing down the efficacy, the safety, the long-term, safety profile, and so on. And this is where you actually lead to then designating a target indication for that particular compound. And that target indication statement that will likely then go into a product label in a given country like the US based on these results from phase 3. Now, throughout this process, you have a dialogue, of course, ongoing with the regulatory agency. For example, before you start the first human dose, there's such thing as IND, which is the Investigational New Drug Application. You cannot begin testing in humans and transporting medications across state lines without having approval from the regulatory agency, for example. At the end of phase 2, there is such a thing as end of phase 2 meeting with the agency, where not only you review all the findings from phase 1 and 2, but then you actually decide how the phase 3 will work. At the end of phase 3, then you end up with filing for this NDA, the New Drug Application, and this is the subject for an FDA approval of having an authorization for the drug to be available on the market. So this is kind of an expanded timeline. Mind you that before that, there are years of basic research, discovery research, preclinical testing. When you add all of that together, we're talking roughly perhaps 10 to 12 maybe years in a traditional sense of how long it takes to test a medication from early phase on to the clinic. And roughly 5,000, 10,000 compounds tested. Usually you get one approved by the FDA as an example. And it takes about 10 to 12 years, and it costs about $2 billion with a B to develop one medication. That's kind of the more recent estimates. So that's kind of in a nutshell, lots behind the scenes, but just a flavor of this whole kind of clinical research.
That was a tour de force overview. Now, JoAnne, tell us about the governing body of clinical trials. What's a steering committee? What's an executive committee? What's a DSMB?
So as has been laid out, there is this tremendous opportunity to the tune of multiple billions of dollars to develop drugs. None of that occurs without advice, guidance, or engagement of scientific leaders from academia, from internally. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for all of you to think about how you can insert yourself in the process. And one of the things when I was sitting in academics, I had no idea what went on to bring a drug to market. And only by becoming more involved, with Christie, for example, on scientific advisory boards for companies to help them define their pathway, did I start to really understand all these different opportunities as they exist. So whether it's, ultimately these can be starting in discovery, if you're a basic researcher, doing these small proof of concept in vitro models, moving to in vivo models, moving to phase 1, but each of these need to have guidance, particularly in phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, which wasn't mentioned, the post-approval studies. All of those typically will have an executive committee made up of advisors, a steering committee. But then there's the executional activities that need to happen to actually conduct a trial. And so this is where you get AROs, CROs, a variety of other individuals and groups that then execute on the trial. So Pam, I'm not really answering your question, but there are so many ways to insert yourself in any of these committees. The key, though, what I realized, is that as much as we'd like to think that this is solely a meritocracy and about your work and your research, 90% of this is about relationships. 90% of this is about, particularly as women, volunteering, being confident in your abilities, and putting your hand up to people that are running, the heads of a steering committee, the head of a DSMB, the head of an executive committee for a trial, and getting involved early in the scientific process and discussion. And if that doesn't happen, we can't always rely. Not everyone is a he for she, as many of the people are sitting with me. We can't rely on other people to pull us up all the time. So we have to think very deliberately about how to insert ourselves in the process.
So Kelly, from an industry perspective, who are the key people that are involved in clinical trials, and how do you develop a protocol?
So by key people, you mean internal, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's all.
Yeah, okay. So I think what JoAnne and my colleague on the left did a really nice job of doing is laying out those different phases of the trial. So what I would like to focus on is we think about protocol development and who's involved from industry. It depends on the study that you're talking about. So looking at large randomized clinical trials, for instance, oftentimes if they're label-enhancing studies, things that are looking for new indications or new clinical endpoints, we oftentimes work very closely with global colleagues because those have widespread implications for Europe, for Japan, for China, for the US. And so internally, those would be people, clinical development, medical affairs, very, very closely involved. Our clinical trial leads, drug safety, regulatory. Internally, that's a unit that absolutely is responsible for executing all aspects of that trial. And what is wonderful about that is it's a very, very close interface to what JoAnne was just talking about, is the executive committee and the steering committee meetings. When you develop a protocol, we would like to think that we would never operate within a vacuum. You always want to get scientific advice from the academic community, from the community that is actually going to be using the medication. You know, you're not going to spend tens of millions, billions of dollars sometimes, and 10 to 12 years to develop a drug, and you don't end up doing the right kind of study that gives the FDA or Europe a label that is going to benefit patients. So you want to make sure that you're actually collaborating in such a way that your study design, your patient population, actually is really fulfilling an unmet need. So I don't know if that answered your question. I think each company probably operates under something very, very similar. Those are the key critical functions internally. And then the execution of that, we rely a lot on whether we do it internally as a company or an ARO or a CRO. But we also rely a lot on our industry field colleagues, MSLs, and folks that are extended arms of the industry to help make sure that investigators are really motivated to enroll. So in a nutshell, I think that's about it.
So the next question is for all three of you, Mohamed, JoAnne, and Kelly, is what is the process by which you select members of the steering committee and your executive committee?
I can start,
Yes.
if you don't mind. This is something as Pam knows, I'm super passionate about. It's not just about expertise. I mean, if you look at this shift in where the demographics are in the US, we have spent, and if I forget to thank you in advance, the organizer of this meeting, it has been phenomenal. But even the things that we heard about yesterday and today, and looking at the demographic shifts in women and underrepresented in trials, and African Americans and Hispanics, you want to make sure that we're selecting people on DSMBs and executive committees, especially executive committees and steering committees that have the ability to bring those underrepresented patient populations to the table. They understand the challenges that we face. They understand how we actually can increase representation. So diversity, women, and even racial and ethnic groups as well, just to make sure that we're adequately representing the patient population we're actually studying.
I agree. Maybe I just move on since we are going in a sequence. So I agree with you, Kelly. Definitely, really important as far as the diversity of representation, but also the diversity of, specialization, if you will. So of course, you have to have the expertise to be on these committees for sure. And the expertise is not only therapeutic area expertise, of course, that's very important. But sometimes if you have that knowledge of regulatory ins and outs, how regulatory agencies think, for example, that's quite a unique thing to have. Understanding, and having some experience in running clinical trials, multi-center, multi-country type of trials is very, very important. Having, the different, therapeutic areas involved in a disease represented on that. For example, if you are looking at a study with heart failure, but also looking at cardiovascular, not only cardiovascular kidney outcomes, you need to have diversity of therapeutic, representation on those committees. And then, individuals clearly that, that have the ability to have the time to invest in that. So that's another important element because clearly is a time demanding. It's not somebody's full-time job, but they have to carve out that time and commitment to be able to really serve on these important committees. Also those that have wide, kind of experience in publishing and knowing the, the ins and outs of being authors and, speakers at various, large-scale symposia and so on. Different things you have to look for, depends on the scale of the study and the nature of the disease you're testing, but definitely variety of elements you have to balance out to find the right mix of representation on those committees.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think we're all here at this conference, right, thinking about this in a very aspirational way, right, and the need to do this in a future state where we actually ensure diversity in the leadership. But the reality still exists that this is not done as purposefully as my colleagues do it at their organizations, and that there's a lot of friends of, there's a lot of risk aversion in industry, quite frankly, to go with known quantities who conduct trials. And so the key here is really to ensure that you have the skill set and develop the experience and the knowledge and the tools required to actually be an effective individual to run trials. We know that there's a very small group of people that continue to execute trials, and Roxana, you can speak to this. There are certain large clinical trial groups that are the keepers, if you will, of that information and skill set. And until we really break down that and ensure that everyone, irrespective of gender, race, cultural background, diversity of thought, actually develop that skill set, we'll continue to have just a few of us on a podium trying to push for this and not having the people available with the right skill set to do this. So I think these are things that we have to be realistic. So for those of you who are interested in doing trials, you have to arm yourself with those tools, with that expertise, and really step up to be counted as an important individual in this space.
So now I want to talk to Roxana and Christie, who really are, from an international perspective, the leaders in clinical trials and have been involved in so many really fundamental, groundbreaking clinical trials. So first, what do you like about it?
Thank you, Christie. I mean, it is, I wish that there were more women who found it as exciting and rewarding as I do. I think there is nothing more rewarding than designing a clinical trial, especially if it's one that you believe will have an important clinical implication that will change practice, and that you would kind of come out with answering a question that you face every day, and you gather the information, you put together a protocol, you get some funding, you move ahead, you implement it, the results come out, you're in the New England Journal of Medicine, and then the guidelines change. Now, what can be better than that? I was able to do that, but it was a 25-year journey before I could get to designing the Twilight study. It took 25 years of hard work, understanding the intricacies of clinical studies and clinical trials, becoming friends with the exclusive club members who own the ownership of all of those clinical trials. And then once I executed that particular trial, I think then it took that time to say, wow, why don't we have this woman on some of our executive committees? So it wasn't so simple, Pam. It was really, really hard work. And so for women who are out there who think, well, tomorrow I can be the PI of the most important clinical trial and be out there, it's easier for the guys because the guys pat each other and they give each other, they bring them into the club, into the exclusive club, their mentees, et cetera, as long as they're still there. But it's more difficult for women. But I'll tell you, and my daughter, I have 3 daughters, they ask me, why are you doing this? Aren't you a doctor? Why are you always sitting behind a computer and taking all these meetings and traveling so much? And I say, well, as a doctor, I realize that I can take care of the patient in front of me, and I still do that 2 days a week. But as a researcher, I believe when I answer the right question that I'm helping millions of patients. And that, to me, is absolutely the most rewarding thing that could ever be. And that's what I like about it, Pam. It is unbelievable. And some of the work that I did, and I remember the topic of contrast-induced acute kidney injury, and nobody wanted to discuss that because it wasn't a toy, it wasn't a stent, it didn't have companies looking after it. And so they would put me in the side room and say, you, Roxana, you talk about that in that corner room. And so I took those lemons, and over the years, I realized that actually this was something that was happening in our patients after cath, and no one was paying attention to it. It was under-recognized, underappreciated, and people were just using contrast media like it was nobody's business. And so I came up with a risk score that has been used now. It's in every EPIC. All the EPIC people are, it's in every hospital record system. They're figuring out what's the risk of acute kidney injury using the Mehran score. Now, no company gave me money for that. It was a question, and it was basically put on the side room and making lemonade out of those lemons I was served. And so what it was is thinking, this is an important question. I'm going to put it out there, and I'm okay to speak about that. And when the New England Journal of Medicine called me and said, you write the review article for us for contrast-induced acute kidney injury, I knew that that lemonade tasted really, really good. So I would just say that when you are rejected and you are not given the opportunities, seek for more. And I think the times are a lot better now because I'm working hard in convincing, and I don't think we have to convince anymore because you just heard from our trial leaders, our industry leaders who are actually believing that diversity and inclusion is really great. And when you have women at the table, and you have women and diverse people at the table designing your study, you all of a sudden are hearing from people with different ideas that actually matter, rather than hearing the same old thing, doing the same old way over and over again. And I think that that has really enriched the environment, and I do believe that now they are looking for. So this is like a great opportunity. You just heard JoAnne Foody, who's, to me, was one of my mentors. I'm learning from her, from all of her work, tell you that this is what she wants to do. She wants new people. She wants to find ways of the talented women and non-white male, basically, investigators to come forth and to share their ideas. Now, Christie, please, you're a white male and I love you. And nothing against white men. I'm married to one. I love him. And they are not a canceled culture. Please understand that too, because that's what they're all saying. But the truth is, that we need to embrace diversity and inclusivity, because I know when Christie sits there with his diverse group and he's just saying to me, why aren't you coming to work with me and all that? My God, Christie Ballantyne wants me to work with him. Like, wow, that's amazing. But what I'm saying is that you're realizing that the diversity of opinion is so good for success of any program and implementation of the work that you're doing. Who cares about a study that enrolls 27,000 patients and has 9 African American patients in it? In what way are you asking me to embrace that and implement that in my clinic in Harlem? I can't do it. And so it's really important to have an understanding of those things. So, you asked me a question, went all over the place. But anyway, basically, it is one of the, can you tell I love clinical trials or what? I love it. It's absolutely the most rewarding, amazing thing. And I'm sorry, Christie, now you can go.
Let's put Christie on the spot a little bit. So you're part of the club, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what club. Yes. It's in a way I've never been part of any club with it. I did cardiology, but when I was a resident, my father was a surgeon, and I almost went into surgery. And then when I went into medicine, but I thought cardiology is cool because you get to do procedures. It's kind of like surgery, but you get to follow patients. But when I was a resident, and I was in clinic, and people with diabetes would come in with CKD, and they'd have had a stroke and an MI and lose a toe. And I thought, we're just palliating the symptoms of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And we're not treating it. And my father had an MI when I was a junior in high school, and never knew my grandfather died of a stroke. So there's a lot of heart disease in my family and diabetes. And I thought, this is ridiculous. We need to understand the disease and treat it and prevent it instead of palliating symptoms. So I think the first thing is you have to have passion about a problem. And then I thought, well, if I want to do something, I need to, everybody's smart and working on this, they know what to do, and everybody in cancer was going in, was doing genetics and molecular biology. So I thought I'll go do a postdoc. I do training in that. I did genetics after a fellowship. Made no money. My wife thought I was crazy. Turned down doing interventional with it because they asked me to do it, and I was a basic researcher, but I always liked clinical research. And then you realize if you're going to actually make an impact, you have to do patients. It has to go to patients, and industry has the funds to make things happen for patient care. And I got involved with clinical research. So the key thing is there's opportunities to get involved with studies at any level, even if you just go to the investigator meeting. When you go to the investigator meeting, ask questions, meet people, talk about the protocol, make connections, And then you'll get a chance, things break through that where you publish. And if you publish, that's what you learn in basic research. You learn to ask questions, test hypotheses, how to write, think critically. But if you publish, you'll get a break, and then you'll get to be PI of some study. And if you recruit well and do well, the next thing you know, you start to move up with it. Now, it does help that you know, if you're from an institution that has a good name in an area, it helps with it. So, and that's the other thing, you may move, you make connections, but, you know, it was a lot of serendipity, but I still, you know, I could still go to a lab meeting every Monday morning, which is, you know, basic research, and I do biomarkers. So I don't know, which club am I in? I mean, you know, I do, it's a very, lots of different things with it, but the theme, there's a central theme is we still don't do a great job preventing cardiovascular disease and treating it, and we can do better. And I've realized now it's not just atherosclerosis is the problem. You know, heart failure, and particularly heart failure with preserved EF, which is in women such a problem, and which causes a lot of atrial fibrillation. I thought you were talking earlier this morning about this borderline large left atrium. You know, these changes are happening structurally in your heart as you get older, and then you have other problems afterwards. But we've got to start earlier with it. So there's opportunities. It is a lot of work, and that is the challenge with it. Is that that work-life balance is tough because it takes extra effort. You know, Roxanne, you were talking about all the, you know, hours you put in for it. So. You know, I'm not the best person. I overdid it when I was younger with it. Fortunately, I had a very supportive wife who also told me, you know, you were fun when I was married you, but you've really, she basically, the ultimatum of, look, you know, you need to kind of, you know, back, you're off the deep end a little bit. See, I told one of my role models, I don't work as hard as my role model. She said, he's pathological. You know, and she was right. But anyway, there's opportunities, particularly more now than ever. But it's a passion, make the connections, get started, and things will open up if you pursue it.
Yeah.
Kelly, you had a...
I wanted to add one more thing, only because I got here a little bit late yesterday, but I think off to my right, I don't know where there were a couple of folks here from Cardio Nerds. And when you talk about marrying early passion and experience with opportunity, I can give you one very, very relevant, timely, critical example. So the Paraglide HF study is a study of HFpEF. We got the Cardio Nerds group involved, and about 15 sites, we now have, just from that Cardio Nerds group that's helping recruit for that study, 55% women and 82% of ethnic racial diversity. So talking about getting involved early, that's an opportunity at a fellow level, right? So thank you. I don't know if any of you were involved, but that's just a really great best practice.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and let's talk about what can we do. I think some of it is we have to provide the right training. I think Mohamed said this really well. We're talking about the breaking the glass ceiling, but what about the foundation? And so what is the skill set that if one wants to eventually lead clinical trials and be a Roxana or Christie, what skills do they need to develop now? Is it statistics? Is it design? What are the...
You know, I think I've seen in our residency and fellowship programs, they teach fundamentals of clinical research, they have statistics. We have programs where if you really want to go this way, you can usually get a master's degree with just doing a little bit of extra time for it. That's a very good foundation to have that under your belt. And, you know, particularly the younger people are very good with social media. Social media is a good way to make connections. I've seen people do this, but I mean, they're much better than, you know, some of these older people like us, like me. But my fellowship program, the guy said, you have to start because all the other fellowship programs are doing this. But I do think that foundation is important, like you said. Get this biostatistical background. The world's big data now. And so the better foundation you have, the easier it will be to compete.
Maybe I'll add to that. Completely agree. And I think, you know, of course, it's difficult to find the time to do a master's degree in something that sometimes, there are also other pragmatic ways to get the experience. So for example, you can be a co-investigator with a more seasoned investigator. You can be a sub-investigator in studies. You can actually kind of get your feet wet. Definitely, learning some of the basics of what is a clinical trial, what is the anatomy of that, how do you come up with a good research question? You had a good research question. It's not difficult to come up with a good question. It's just that, to find one that is feasible, relevant, testable, and so on and so forth. So find that. And then really having some understanding of some of the basics of hypothesis testing. You don't have to be a statistician. You just need to know the basics and so on. So some of those basic nuances and elements really are ones that you can learn as you go, but then really associate yourself with others, more senior folks that have done it, be a co-investigator, sub-investigator, learn on the job, but also, get involved in multi-center, larger scale trials. You don't have to do your own study first. You could be a site in a multi-center study in a maybe smaller scale that you can learn that, and then subsequently you do your own investigator-initiated study. Then subsequently, you're a lead investigator on another bigger study, then multinational study, then executive committee. So it really, as you said, you go one step at a time and really build as you go. But that foundational, skill set is really important. So as I said, instead of thinking of the, how do you break the glass ceiling, let's fix the broken windows first. Let's learn the tricks. Let's understand beyond just the day-to-day patient care. How else can I really get myself ready to be a clinical trialist in a stepwise manner to learn some of those basics as I go?
So, I couldn't agree more that some fundamental training, and also especially in the United States, if you're going to take on being a co-investigator or an investigator, you have to understand the regulatory responsibilities and what it is that you're taking on. And it's not just about good clinical practice, but it's about drug accountability, device accountability, adverse event reporting, understanding IRBs. Those are fundamental things that you absolutely have to learn. But I'm just going to put a little bit of a gender twist here, because guys kind of get on these things without any of these trainings, but we as women, we don't want to do those things unless we're absolutely trained and we want to do it absolutely perfect. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, I just want to say that what I think Mohamed said is, to me, if you're going to do this seriously, you really should have some training, some real fun. It would be great to have a Master of Science degree where you actually, and what Christie said is absolutely fundamental, because I think I would have people would listen to me a lot faster if I had a little Master of Science after my name, even though I think I'm understand it better than most people, but still, it is really difficult to get people to listen to me. So that as kind of an important thing, and if you're going to do it for a lifetime and you want to be a trialist, it would be good to have that. But I want to tell you how many executive committees, steering committees, clinical events committees, data safety monitoring boards I've sat on, and I've served on hundreds of these, where there have been male members who know nothing about clinical trials, and somehow they're at that table, been given the respect, and everyone wants to hear their thoughts, maybe because they have a lot of patients, maybe because somebody has a relationship, et cetera. So I always say, we as women, we want to do it perfectly, but it doesn't have to be so perfect. Right. Don't make your life so absolutely miserable that now, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I can't go to the meetings. I have kids to deal with. I have to take care of the house. I have to do this. And now I have to get another degree and get on these committees. Like, how am I, how? And it's the reason what we were hearing last night, where women are older when they get married, or they are divorced, or they're having late children late, all of those things, especially in the misogynistic world of interventional cardiology. So let's not go there, and let's think about ways that we can teach each other, and it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Yeah. So, and hopefully industry and our colleagues will help identify the brilliant young woman or person of color who is really excited, really enthusiastic, wants to be involved, and is willing to learn, to give them the opportunity. So I really think it's important.
And Roxana, and not to belittle education or degrees or training, but so much of this is an apprenticeship. So much of everything that goes on is really finding those people as you continue your journey to find the person. Now, if I ask of this audience, how many of you have actually put a patient in a trial and enrolled a patient? Okay, so that's a start. When I started fellowship and was in the CCU at Cleveland Clinic, there was a folder of all the trials. And if you didn't enroll your patients that evening, Steve Nissen, who was the CCU attending, would get very disappointed, I'll say. But by starting that process, it started me thinking about, well, what is the protocol? What happens? Now, I also want to say that I sat on a panel about a decade ago, and I don't think things have changed, that basically looked at women and women being involved in leadership positions and what has happened. And to Roxana's point, women believe that they need so much more training, so much more expertise to even volunteer. And no disrespect to my male colleagues, they will volunteer themselves to be head of a committee with far less experience and training than a woman who will always put herself as the volunteer on that committee and never elevate herself to be chair of that committee. And so I think that this is something that as women, everyone needs to really volunteer themselves. And I use the word insert very purposely, that you have the right to be there. Don't get fooled that, and again, you don't need a master's of science. You don't need any more degrees, Roxana. You know, that there are ways to do this and leverage the experience that you have and the insight and the aptitude without making it more complicated, I think, than it has to be.
I do want to, we're slightly running over, but I want to make sure that we give time to the audience to ask any questions. If any of you have questions, please go to the podium.
Pam, one thing in any career is any mentors. You can have more than one mentor, too, for a different thing. Then the other one is collaborators. If someone's asking you to do a project, do they deliver? Because you don't want to waste your time. You look at who publishes, who gets things done. The other thing is just your whole thing of saying no to things, time, efficiency. I'll never forget the person, as I said, I've worked under a woman postdoc who's now in the National Academy of Science. She was the most efficient person in terms of no nonsense. I don't know how she had 2 kids, she's married, she was a physician, and she's been incredible. But she didn't waste a minute. And you really can't waste any time if you're trying to do all this stuff. You've got to, and that was an incredible role model for me.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to such luminaries, both from the academic side and from the industry side. It's incredible to hear about clinical trial design. I had a question about, I think we've talked a lot about drug development and being involved in drug clinical trials, and I'm curious about sort of the medical device aspect and whether, I know the regulatory landscape is certainly a little bit more complicated on the medical device side, and whether you feel, are there certain nuances to getting involved in the medical device landscape as compared to the sort of the drug development side?
Yeah, so actually, the process is very, very similar in terms of, phase 1 through phase 4 trials. The regulatory requirements for approval is a little bit different. Obviously, if there's a disruptive therapy, there are all these different pathways that you could get in faster. There are early feasibility studies now, and those phase 1 becomes really a very early feasibility. Can you put the device in, and will it do its work? After you've tested it in preclinical work, both on the bench as well as the animal model. All of those have to be approved by the FDA before you even go into the phase 1, and there's no normal volunteer because these are implantable devices. So the very first phase is actually patients with the conditions to basically figure out what's happening, what do we have to do. So if you think about and I don't know if you've been listening and watching the 20-year TAVR and hearing from the TAVR, from the people who actually invented the technology and what they went through to the proof of concept, then putting it in multiple animals, but first dead animals, then real animals, and then bringing it to fruition with that first patient. Those are really, really rigorous, both bench testing as well as preclinical testing that goes on. The phase 2, on the other hand, is, again, sometimes is surrogate endpoints to try to figure out what would be sort of your main pivotal trial. And sometimes you could skip the phase 2 to go right into phase 3, depending on what you're getting and what you're seeing in your early feasibility trials. And then phase 3, again, is with approval with the FDA, because you have to have an investigational device exemption or an IDE. And even if it's off-label use, you may need an IDE. So, like, for example, in the Twilight trial, which was a drug study, we filed both an IDE because it was in the PCI patient population, and we were withdrawing aspirin in a double-blind, placebo-controlled fashion. So we needed to make sure that we weren't going to get into trouble with the stent with the device in terms of stent thrombosis, because that was an endpoint. And so we went to the FDA with an IDE, and we were exempt, interestingly enough. And then when we went to the drug side, the CDRH, so there is CDRH and then there's CEDAR. And when we went to CEDAR for the NDA, they allowed us to proceed with a research NDA. So very different, but again, there are also combination of device and drug that comes together. So it is a little bit more complicated, but believe it or not, it's not as, you don't have to study tens of thousands of patients, so a little bit easier. Happy to talk to you anytime about it.
We have, I want to give Sadia the last question.
I don't think I can have the last word, though. That's always Roxana. I just wanted to ask a question about how we can ensure that this happens. So I think quality metrics are a great example. Nothing changes until you require benchmarks. So how do we do the same in clinical trials, whether it's benchmarks for steering committees, executive boards, patient enrollment, so that part of the trial being successful is not just that there's an FDA recommendation that we need to include women in trials, but there has to be a certain percentage enrolled.
So I want to just quickly take that, because I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. The FDA has put out guidelines to enroll women and underrepresented minorities from over 15 years ago, and the needle has not changed at all, certainly in the interim. So just leaving it like that and having some kind of a metric that you're not actually going to get approved unless you do these things, that is something that's been very difficult for the FDA to put in place, because you can't slow down innovation and patient care if you're not, if you basically say, if you don't do this, we're not going to approve your device. So it's not happened. But I agree with you that we have to come up with a creative way that doesn't slow up science and that it allows innovation to move on. And I think that there are pathways, and I certainly have a few of them that I want to do and work with colleagues and people to make sure. But it's changing, and I'll let Kelly talk about it because I know she wants to say it.
No, I just want to build on that for a second. From the industry side, we basically put benchmarks in place to say we want 30% of this or 50% of this. We don't always get there unless we actually start saying, we're not going to enroll any more men until we get to our cap of women, or we want to make sure that the preemptive assumptions that we went in with are actually brought to the end patient population for the clinical trial. So it doesn't always happen, but we're starting to move that way, that we actually go in with, this is our allotment of what we actually want to try to achieve. So I think we are moving the needle a bit. We've got a lot more work to do, though, for sure.
Maybe just to add to that, and I think there is a lot of good work in that front, as far as enrolling, underrepresented minority in trials. And in fact, the last study, for example, that we have
Is
just
it though?
published.
Where have you seen, where are we, maybe there's work, but I haven't seen.
Different companies have
Underrepresented minorities
different approaches to it, and definitely, in my experience and where I am now, we definitely have similar, kind of parameters saying that we really have to make sure that certain representations exist. The last study, over 6,000 patients, 50% were women, as an example. But I think the area that is even more difficult is to have that representation at the governance of clinical trial, management. And this is the difficult one. There's no standard. There's no FDA to regulate that. It really becomes very individually kind of company. And it's really very difficult. And this is the one that really, how do we really improve that?
Sadia, we did something very radical with Boston Scientific. They wanted to do a study, and I said, okay, and they said, we want women. I said, okay, we'll design the study, and we will exclude white men. And it was myself and Wayne Batchelor, who's an African-American cardiologist, a previous president of the American Black Cardiologists, and the two of us chose the executive committee and the sites in representing patients who, in areas, so almost all of our site investigators, all 60 sites, had a PI that was either a woman or an underrepresented minority. No white male PIs. We enrolled in less than 8 months, which was supposed to be 18 months, 1,800 patients who were women, minorities, Hispanics, in record time, and delivered for the first time data on drug-eluting stents in that patient population. So it is absolutely possible. The question is industry ready to make those bold moves, which is bold, and we don't want to cancel any culture. Nobody wants to do that. In a way to say, okay, I'm doing a 17,000 patient study, and Kelly just said, I'm going to record that maybe we will stop enrolling our white male population because we've got enough.
Right. Exactly.
And now let's just keep those sites are still engaged. Now they have to look for those patients, and they'll find them because they get paid a certain amount of money to enroll patients. And so there is some reward there, and they'll find them, and we will have the answers. So it is absolutely possible. But if our executive committee and the steering committee still looks the same as the same friends and people that we know, it will be more difficult. So we've got to do all those things together.
And Roxana, I think the other thing from an industry perspective is that we have to pay for performance in these trials. We have to pay IQVIA more for appropriate representation and less when they don't enroll, because it's far easier for the current institutions to just continue business as usual. And in the end, it's a business, right? So it has to be about a stick and a carrot and really ensuring that, you set those benchmarks.
Yeah, exactly.
And until we do that consistently across the board, it won't happen.
Well, what a remarkable panel and discussion. This was, I mean, so incredible to get really kind of your honest and feedback. And I'm looking to a lot of the people in the audience, including some cardio nerds and our cardiology fellows, and I really hope that this has inspired you to get into clinical trials. And as Roxana said, you don't have to get every single degree, but just get out there, and we have a lot more to talk about. So